People have been using pictures to tell stories and convey messages since prehistory, but the advent of film brought a whole new dimension to the concept. One of the first world leaders to see this new medium as an excellent platform for propaganda was Vladimir Lenin, although it wouldn't take long for his peers to catch on. As such, the earliest film schools were founded in the Soviet Union. Its students would study the psychological impacts and effects of filmmaking exhaustively, sometimes up to the point where they would cut up a film and examine it frame by frame. Many innovations made by Soviet film students have become a standard element of filmic storytelling, but the most famous is arguably the Kuleshov effect. Named after Moscow Film School founder Lev Kuleshov, this phenomenon was demonstrated in a short edit where a static image of a man was juxtaposed with some delicious food, a woman in a coffin, or an attractive person reposed on a divan. Test subjects were asked what the man was thinking, and depending on what the second image was, their answers changed dramatically. While this feels a bit more intuitive in a modern, media-saturated landscape, in the early 20th century it was revelatory to see such an obvious case of two sequential images implying more meaning than a single image presented in isolation. You can see that notion play out in this gag strip, one of the most reliable frameworks in the comics idiom. The first panel introduces an expectation, the second panel expands upon this expectation, and then the third panel creates humor by subverting the expectation in some way. This Peanuts cartoon I'm showing here is over 50 years old, and for many, its joke may be a bit stale or even predictable, thanks to repetition and a shifting zeitgeist. Still, the formula of presenting an assumption, establishing its weight, and then undercutting it in some fashion remains a core component of many a modern comic. The paint job may be different, but the foundation hasn't been changed. Comics is a very different medium than film in numerous ways, but it shares an ability to imply compounded meaning with the artful use of sequentially arranged images. Like all art forms, comics has a unique vocabulary that can be exploited by the practitioner in a multitude of fashions. A comic can be compact and minimal, or lush and expansive. It can be massive in scope, or focused upon the quotidian. It can be wild, sedate, wacky, sobering, joyous, empathetic, angry, or any number of other adjectives. It all depends on what the artist is trying to say and the skill in which they express themselves. For this video, I'll be going over some of the basic tools that any comics artist has at their disposal. I'll also be giving a brief overview of how these tools can be manipulated to convey certain ideas more effectively. Let's begin with the two most obvious components of most comics. It's often said that comics are a marriage of words and images conveyed across sequential panels. That's not entirely the case, as single-panel cartoons and wordless comics are far from difficult to find, but that definition fits more often than it doesn't. Regardless, the balance between text and imagery is a delicate one that a judicious comics artist is very mindful of. Older American comics would drown the reader in verbiage. The infamous EC comics of the 1950s would include copious narrative captions that were largely there to instruct the artist what they were supposed to draw. As time went on, superfluous narration fell out of vogue, and it became more popular to reduce the text to the essential. Why write a caption about a man throwing a punch when there's a perfectly fine image that conveys the idea far more efficiently and effectively than a written description ever could? Of course, the flip side of this dynamic is that illustrations can rob the story of depth and nuance. What one person conjures in their mind while reading Jane Eyre will vary wildly from what another person will think up while going over the very same words, but both see the same relative thing when they look at Impression Sunrise. Good drawings can provide simple instruction better than almost any speech, but they can fall short of conveying abstract concepts and ideas. That's where the text often comes back in. Sure, an image of a man throwing a punch will demonstrate the raw idea with more impact than just about any written account, but how does that man feel when he's performing this act? Is there a hidden conflict behind his stoic expression? Is there pain shooting through his knuckles? What kind of smell is wafting through the room as this action is taking place? Why is the man doing this? What does he think will come of it? The text in this scenario serves to flesh out the details that the drawing itself cannot demonstrate alone. The storyteller will showcase their own priorities based on what they choose to highlight in their text. Perhaps it will be a third-person narrator describing the force of the blow, maybe a first-person narrative centering on the assailant, the victim, or both at the same time. Having no dialogue or narration is also on the table. Any of these choices, and more besides, will have an effect on how the narrative is being told. The comics panel itself is a protean tool for the right artist. Multiple panels of similar size can convey fast-paced action, especially if there's little to no text accompanying it. A massive splash panel that takes up all or most of a page can signify a climactic moment. Widescreen panels imply epic breadth, while other shapes can be manipulated to demonstrate emotional intimacy. Panels that do not change in size or shape can be inferred as occurring at a consistent pace. Conversely, radical alteration in panel shape can be thrown in to convey shock, frenzy, or a severe alteration to the emotional beats leading up to that moment. The figures in the comic story also have a great deal to say to the reader. A simple, broad action story often demands dynamic poses, bold forms, and an overarching adherence to aesthetic simplicity. A meditative character study, on the other hand, will usually call for a less aggressive approach. The layouts will be far less flashy, smaller details will have more space to unfold themselves, and the characters will often be drawn with more subtle body language. There are, of course, a number of ways for a skilled artist to play with audience expectations. To use a pretty famous example, Watchmen was created as a postmodern deconstruction and analysis of the tropes associated with the superhero genre. The idea was that if superheroes existed in the real world, they'd probably either be ineffective buffoons or dangerous maniacs. As such, artist Dave Gibbons does not depict his superheroes with the idealized, larger-than-life sense of glamour that such characters usually warranted. The protagonists of Watchmen are dressed like Superman and Wonder Woman, but they look and move like ordinary, unspectacular people. Instead of evincing Greek demigods when they pose, they come off as a bit pathetic. When they are violent, they are gruesome instead of cathartic, fascistic instead of righteous, scary and aloof instead of protective. Alan Moore's writing has gotten heaps of praise for how it dissects the superhero genre and reflects the baser feelings of those who love it, but Gibbons' drawing serves this purpose just as effectively as any printed word on the page, sometimes more so. Watchmen would have been received very differently if the costume figures within it looked like they were drawn by John Buscema. This point is further demonstrated in the 2009 film adaptation of Watchmen. Despite faithfully recreating the visuals of the comic right down to lifting panels straight from the page and transferring them to the screen, director Zack Snyder ignored the mundanity of Gibbons' figure work and made his protagonists look just as extraordinary and powerful as typical superheroes. That's the main reason why it's common to criticize the film as an extremely literal adaptation that still manages to miss the entire point of the source material. There are, of course, many other forms of visual shorthand a comic artist can employ. Backlighting a character's face can make them appear menacing. An eagle-eyed perspective on a character can make them appear weak and insignificant, while a worm's eye view will make the same figure appear powerful and massive. The reader, drawing upon their own experiences and expectations, will absorb the mood and ambience of the artwork, often in ways they are not fully cognizant of. Every facet of the comic's construction, from the saturation of the color to the shape of the lettering, contributes to this effect. If you'd like more information on the storytelling mechanisms behind comics, Scott McCloud's Understanding Comics: The Invisible Art is often seen as the definitive text on the subject. I personally think that's a great place for beginners to start, but McCloud himself cites Will Eisner's instructional books as his own inspiration. I would recommend Eisner's graphic storytelling and visual narrative as the logical next step, although comics and sequential art is very good as well. If you want to get hyper-detailed, Mark Newgarden and Paul Karasik's How to Read Nancy comprehensively explains how a 3-panel comic strip delivers its message through a multitude of layers. Of course, the most effective way you can discover how to tell a story through comics is to start making your own. I would argue that comics are among the most democratic of artistic mediums. One does not need a massive production budget or lots of expensive equipment to make a comic book. One doesn't even really need to be a virtuosic technician to be an effective cartoonist. The most beloved comics artist of all time is arguably Charles Schulz, whose simple layouts won't make anyone think of Rembrandt. Anyone with a pencil or a stylus can become a comics artist. Anyone with access to a copy machine or an internet connection can share their comic with the world. I hope I've demonstrated that the comics medium is elastic enough to accommodate a wide spectrum of styles, concepts, and ideas. In fact, I'd argue that it could very well be the perfect medium for what you have to say.